Great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're talking about surviving and thriving with virtual learning, practical strategies to make at-home learning work for you. And I first want to thank Kelly Mountain and Kathleen Donovan from the Arlington County Parent Resource Center for hosting this today. And Kathleen and Kelly, I'd love to turn it over to you so that you can welcome all of our guests this evening.
Hi, everyone. This is Kelly, and I work with Kathleen at the Parent Resource Center, and just wanted to say hello and welcome to our new school year, and know that although we're not physically at the PRC, we are definitely here for you virtually. So give us a call, send us an email, whatever we can do to help. We are happy to do it. So, and Anne, thank you so much for being here with us. You've always been a great friend to Arlington, and we welcome you tonight.
Thank you, Kelly. And Kathleen, thank you so much for having me this evening. All right, so let's go ahead and get started and talk about strategies for making this work this year. I've compiled a lot of the things that we're going to talk about this evening, but also other strategies into an ebook. It's about a 14-page ebook titled 6 Tips for Smoother at-Home Learning, even when you're dreading it. And you can get that very easily by texting 55444 in the words virtual, and it will be delivered straight to your inbox. So again, for that ebook, just type in 55444 and virtual. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about this evening. We have 3 key things that are going to be touched upon. First is the designated workspace. There's actually 2 ways we can get our kids set up for learning this year. And we want to do it in a way that's keeping kids focused as they learn. We'll discuss routines, structure, making sure that our kids are following through with what we want them to do. You know, routines are really the backbone of making this day-to-day virtual learning situation work for all of our families. And then lastly, we'll talk about relationships with our kids, which can be difficult when we're together all the time. And it's especially difficult for working parents. So curious in the chat, if you can just type in real quick, what is the grade level of your child? What is your child's grade level? I would love to see so that I can customize this a little bit more. Okay, 7, kindergarten, 8th and 11th, 3rd, 2nd, 4th, 9th, 1st, 8th, 2nd, 6th, 7th. Across the board, 1st. Okay, 3rd. Lots of parents with elementary school, middle, and some high school too. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That gives me a sense of the ages of the kids. So I'll make sure we discuss things across the board for our students. Now, this is how it looked back in March. Life seemed so easy then. Our teacher was at the front of the room instructing our kids. She knew when our kids were on task, when they weren't on task, when they were having a hard time, when they were doing okay. But things are a lot different now. Here's what it looks like. We've got a teacher in a Zoom room with lots of kids. And it sometimes can feel a little less personal. And for kids, it's more difficult. For teachers, it's more difficult. And it's certainly a lot more difficult for us as parents. So what do we do about it? And how can we at home make a difference? How can we equip our kids for success? So here's the first thing we want to do. We want to make sure that we set up a really great designated workspace for our kids. And as I mentioned, there's 2 ways we can do it. First, our students can have an individual desk, which they call their own. It doesn't have to be anything fancy like this. It can be an old card table we drag up from the basement that our grandmother gave us. It doesn't really matter. It just needs to be their own space. Now, if you choose this option, it needs to be in an area that's quiet, but not too quiet. So we wouldn't want to squirrel our 7-year-old 2nd grader away in a guest bedroom upstairs when we're working on the 1st floor. It's too far away. And often when kids feel really isolated, it's harder for them to focus, which kind of seems odd. We would think the quieter, the better, but not always for kids. Ideally for elementary kids, we want them to be within earshot. Certainly as they get older, they want to be more independent. They want to have their privacy. But in general, for younger kids, elementary and in general middle school, their bedroom is not the ideal place unless they've proven to you that they can do a really good job on their own wherever they decide to sit before, they earn the privilege of their bedroom. And if they're able to turn in their work, they're focused, they're generally getting stuff done, maybe later on they can have that privilege. But initially, especially for younger kids, I wouldn't let them I wouldn't set up their workspace in their bedroom, especially if they have attention difficulties. So here's option 2. This is a shared workspace. So this would be great for families that have multiple kids, which most of us do, and maybe there's a space issue. So we want to put all of our kids at one table. Maybe it's the kitchen table or the dining room table. And if that's what we decide, we need to make sure that our kids have visual dividers so that they're not bothering one another. And this is super easy to do, and it's not expensive either. So you can go to Michael's or any craft store and buy one of those science project dividers, like the poster board panels that have 3 sections, kind of like what Paige has here in this picture set up. And you can encourage your child to make it their own. You can see that she decorated hers. I love that she has the schedule on the side. Something like that works great. Or you can go to Lakeshore Learning or Really Good Stuff, a teacher supply store, and find a testing carrel divider, as in this picture. And that's a good option too. It can be an old cardboard box that you have laying around the house. It doesn't really matter. But the main thing is that kids have a place to go to every day. Just like school, they go to a place, their brain needs to know, this is the place I go to do my work. And in addition, they also need that alternate space. So if they're online, they're talking to their teacher, or they're working with their peers, and it's loud, they need somewhere else to go to not disturb the other kids at the table. So that's something to keep in mind as well. We want to make sure we equip our kids for success. So obviously a good Wi-Fi connection, a comfortable chair, which may not be our dining room chair, but it might be something a little bit different, maybe like a ball chair. These are especially great for fidgety kids. We want to make sure they have noise canceling headphones, a student planner to write down their homework and all the work they have to do. And if they're not a pencil and paper kid, they just need some other way. It might be through Google Notes. It could be on their Google Calendar. It doesn't really matter. They just need a place to keep track. And then lastly, they need to keep track of time as well. It's interesting about time. There's research that shows that actually an analog clock is more helpful to kids for time management than a digital clock. And I think it's because that hand moving gives kids a physical sense of elapsed time. And they can also see about how much time they have left to do something. So if you happen to have an analog clock laying around the house, bring it into your child's study area. Some other helpful supplies, not always required, but just helpful. One is an accordion binder. I love accordion binders. I find them to be super helpful because kids have limited paper flow these days. They don't need individual binders for each class anymore. I used to tell kids, make sure you get the 3-ring binder for every class, especially our high schoolers, but not anymore. They don't have a ton of paper flow, but they do need to be organized when they get papers. So for that reason, label the tabs, their subject, make sure they do that. And when they get a piece of a paper or whatever it is, they just put it in the back side of that section. Thereby everything is chronologically organized. And it can fit big things, interactive notebooks, composition books, you name it. I also think kids should have the URLs to their frequently visited sites. So these need to be passwords and usernames so they can easily navigate where they need to be and log in effectively. I love kids having erasable highlighters at their table. These are great to bring kids' attention to something, and when they learn it, they can just erase it. And I'm also a huge fan of erasable colored pencils. I think they're great for Doodle Notes, which we'll talk about in just a second. So before we go on, I want to ask, because we're going to talk about focus in a second, is focus an issue for your child? Yes, no, or sometimes? If you can throw that into the chat, that would be great. Oh my gosh, yes, yes, 100% yes. Yes, 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 sometimes, always, sometimes, 100%. Okay, so it sounds like, yes, in general, people are struggling with this. All right, so let's talk about focus and what that looks like for our kids. Focus, is interesting because we often think that if our kid is sitting at a place with absolutely no distractions, it's going to be really great for them. But the truth is, if we have a fidgety kid that likes to be touching and playing with things, that child is seeking sensory stimulation because the more that they end up getting that sensory stimulation, the more they're able to focus. So here are some things that can be helpful to you. These are, oh, I wish I invented these. These are just mesh pockets with a marble, and kids move the marble back and forth. They play with it when they're learning. I like using fidget tools when kids have to be paying attention to their teacher, for example, or maybe she's showing a PowerPoint and they need to be focused. Giving them something to do and something to fidget with makes them more attentive. We had Silly Putty when we were growing up, and then the more modern version is Neato. We all know fidget spinners. And then lastly, I really like Wiggle Feet. These are sensory cushions for our fidgety kids that need to be doing something with their feet. So those are some fidget toys. Talk to your kids about it. Don't go out and buy them. See maybe which one they might like to have, and it just sits on their table. That's it. Also, I am a huge believer of timers. I love timers. We use timers in my practice for kids in kindergarten and for kids in college. I find them to be incredibly helpful. In fact, the issue with time and the kids that we see, we work with a lot of kids with executive functioning weaknesses and difficulty with procrastination. Often they have ADHD. And this is one thing that pretty much everybody struggles with. And it's this issue of making themselves get started when they don't want to get started. So timers can help with that. Timers can help in two ways. So let's start with procrastination. A timer is helpful because you only want to set it for a very short period of time. So take your child's age and add one. So for example, a 10-year-old, you might set the timer for 11 minutes. And the strategy is work as best you can, as hard as you can, and focus as much as you can just for 11 minutes. And when the timer goes off, you can either keep on going or you can take a break. And typically they can keep on going. They need that timer to get them started. Also, there's a technique called the Pomodoro Strategy, and this is for chunking. So let's say you've got a lot of work to do. Maybe it's that Wednesday, that's a teacher work day, and there's a bunch of homework, and your child has to sit and get it done. Well, if we have the expectation that they're going to sit there for 2 hours and just get everything done in one foul swoop, it's probably not going to happen. But this is where timers come in. So if procrastination isn't always the issue, but it's just that it feels overwhelming, set the timer for say 25 minutes max and say to your child, work on this for 25 minutes and then take a break and then switch to something else. That's called chunking. You're breaking things down into chunks. It's not minuscule like the procrastination issue, but it's a longer swath of time that kids can get stuff done. In fact, there's lots of studies looking at what is that ideal time for individuals. You know, are we most focused for 20 minutes, for 2 hours, for an hour? What is it? And it turns out that 25 minutes is that sweet spot. We're the most motivated in that time frame, but after 25 minutes, our attention starts to wane and we certainly lose focus. So the other thing that's super helpful when kids are having to focus with their teacher is doodling, and specifically Doodle Notes. Doodle Notes are actually the more modern way of taking notes. I know when I was a teacher, I'd always have kids in my class that were doodlers, and it honestly drove me crazy. Sometimes I kind of thought they were being disrespectful, like they weren't paying attention when I was up in front of the room giving a lesson. And so I would say to them, you know, Corinne, come on, pay attention, put your pencil down. But then inevitably, a few minutes later, she'd be at doodling again. Well, turns out that actually doodlers retain more and pay better attention than non-doodlers. So I wish I knew that back then. So Doodle Notes is exactly for that type of person, for the type of person that does well when jotting down information as they go. I love Doodle Notes. As I mentioned, they're the modern way of taking notes because our brain doesn't think in a blank slate. It's really hard when our brain sees a blank piece of paper to know what to write down and to organize it. But Doodle Notes give us the template, and you can see some at the bottom right that are blank. And so it kind of compartmentalizes information for kids. Then I mentioned those colored pencils. They make it their own. They color it, make it pretty, draw pictures to help them remember. And I found that Doodle Notes not only help kids focus when they're taking notes, but also they're much more likely to go back and study their notes because they're attractive looking. So a few other ideas for focus: make sure windows are closed out in the morning, things they don't need before school starts. Ideally, the phone is in another room. So somebody asked this in the beginning. It kind of depends on the age of your child. It's harder to make this work for a high schooler, but for a younger student with a phone, for sure, you can say during these important classes, the phone needs to be in another room. It's okay during breaks if they want to check it, but ideally this is, this will help with focus for sure. And if media usage is a real big issue for you and you're concerned that your kids are spending far too much time online, many of the families we work with use Google Family Link, and they found that to be really successful in keeping track of their kids. So ideally, we want to get our kids buy-in. We don't want to just set up their study area without them, or if it's not working for them, do it on our own in a different way. We wouldn't want to go on Amazon and just buy a bunch of fidget toys because again, that's not getting kids buy-in. We want to ask them, this might work for you, it might not. Take a look at these things. What do you think? Is there anything that might be of interest to you? Anything that we want to do, get our kids buy-in because that often helps when they're part of the decision. Same with controlling screen usage. We can say to them, tell me why you need your phone for this class. Let's talk about it first before we make the decision, absolutely no phones from 9 to 3 o'clock. That's a little bit harder for kids to swallow. So let's talk about routines and schedules. Often this is what is most difficult for families, is sticking to a routine when things feel chaotic. But at a time when kids are more anxious than ever, routines are more important than ever. So routines are times of the day that we generally do things, and they're helpful because kids know what to expect and they're more likely to follow through. It kind of puts them on autopilot. I found too that when we use these words, I've noticed, instead of saying, look, you're going to get up at 7:30, you need to be online at 8:30, that means you need to be at breakfast at 8:15, blah, blah, blah. It's hard for kids to take and they're less likely to follow through. But if you start with these magic words, I've noticed we do better with routines. When we have the same schedule day in and day out, then you might want to talk about the first routine of the day, which is getting up and getting out of bed and getting online in time. So you might say something like, based on what you know about yourself, what would be a good time to get up every morning? And have the discussion with your child. Often they come up with really good suggestions. I like using the words I've noticed. That is often more palatable to kids than you need to get up at a certain time. But by saying I've noticed, it helps kids to be a lot less defensive and it helps us to put us on the same team. With kids, I generally try to avoid why questions. Why weren't you up on time? Why didn't you get up? Why didn't you log on when you were supposed to? Why didn't you turn that in? Why questions are hard for kids because it requires them to consolidate lots of information and boil it down to a reason. And that's very difficult. So instead, you can ask what questions. What would help you get up on time? That's actually easier for kids to answer than a why question. So a couple of other things with the routine. I think it's helpful to talk to kids each morning. Have them print out their schedule each day, especially if it changes from day to day, and make sure it's in their study area. And then just take 2 or 3 minutes each morning and say, tell me what you have going on today. What's your first class? Oh, what do you have after that? And you might even say, what do you plan on doing for your breaks today? So you're just helping kids to think ahead instead of in the now, what is coming up? And that helps fire up their executive function skills. So speaking about breaks, and I think somebody mentioned this a little bit earlier when we were chatting before we started, you know, breaks can be a great thing because it gives kids downtime, and we know breaks help people to consolidate information and learn it. But breaks can also be bad for our kids because for some of them, their natural inclination is to go sit right where they were, pull up Netflix or pull up a video game and just stay on their screen, or go to the Xbox and stay on a different kind of screen. And we don't want our kids on these types of screen activities during their breaks. And there's a couple of reasons. One, we know that things like video games, YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, they're highly engaging, but they're also addicting, and it's hard for kids to stop them. And the reason is when they're engaged in that type of activity, there's a ton of dopamine flowing through their brain. And they have neurons in their brain, and that receiving neuron says, oh, send me more dopamine, more dopamine. And so when we say, hey, put down your phone, get off the Xbox, they don't want to. They're irritable and difficult because their brain is telling them, give me more dopamine. Instead, we want our kids to still be doing things that are fun to them, but these are low dopamine activities. And ideally, they're up and out. They should not be sitting in front of their computer. So we want them maybe riding their bike. Perhaps they're doing an arts and crafts. They're playing with a friend, if that's okay with you. They're building with blocks. But they could even be using an ebook and reading, not a problem, because really all screens are not created equal. You know, there is a difference in the level of dopamine that an ebook puts off, or like a math website than say TikTok. They're very different. So as much as possible, we want to control the more addicting types of break activities. And during these breaks, you know, if our kids can connect with others, all the better. They need something to look forward to. I talk to kids all the time, and they often say, I'm lonely, I miss my friends. And so anytime they can break bread together and they can have an organized lunch, that's super meaningful to them, and it gives them something to look forward to. On the teacher workday, if they can study together virtually or in person, the more they can do with other people, the better. It helps to forge those connections. And then also as part of our routine, I would recommend once a week, just checking in with your kids, ideally Sunday night, to talk about the week ahead. So you might say something like, oh, let's take a look at your schedule. What do you have coming up this week? What are your priorities? What would you really like to get done? You might say, do you have any tests, projects, extracurriculars, big things coming up? And if your child says, yeah, I've got that big science project due, you might say, oh, what's the first thing you want to do to get it done? That's often a better question than you better get started now, or what do you mean you're waiting till right now to get started on that? You've had 3 weeks. So asking questions instead of passing judgment is often more helpful in getting our kids to follow through and do what we want them to do. Sometimes parents will want to check their kids' grades, and I recommend doing this with your child and not at a time when your child's not with you. And here's the reason. Sometimes we'll go online and we'll see a low grade or a missing assignment, and it becomes very negative right away. But when our child is with us, we can say, oh, I noticed you have a late assignment. Tell me about that. And oftentimes there's a reason, and they can explain it to you. And that's better for us than jumping to assumptions when our child is not in the room. And then lastly, we want to preserve our relationships with our kids. This is perhaps the most important thing we can do at this very stressful time. And it can be difficult when we're always together. And it's, I think, even more difficult for working parents. So if you don't mind throwing it in the chat, when you're working from home, are your kids able to be independent with virtual school? Yes, no, or sometimes. And if you haven't gotten to that quite yet, think back to the spring when you were working from home. Were your kids able to be independent? Yes, no, or sometimes, no, yes, no, sometimes, yes. Okay, so it sounds like it's sometimes. Most people are saying sometimes. And a couple people said the 8th grader, yes, the 2nd grader, no. For sure, it also depends on age of the kids. Yes. So let's talk about some strategies for working parents. I mentioned that printed out schedule. I love that schedule. I think kids should have that in their study area. And the reason I like it is because it helps kids understand the flow of the day. And when they're done with the class, they can cross it out or check it off. This kind of helps them think about to-do lists. And actually, when we have a to-do list and we check something off or cross it out, we get this little squirt of dopamine in our brains. And again, it helps kids to think ahead. We also, if we have the luxury of having another adult in the house, we want to designate it a go-to person. So you might say, look, I'm going to be able to help you from 9 to 10, but dad's your go-to person from 10 to 11. If you decide to do something like that, it needs to be in writing. Because if you say, look, I'm going to be on a conference call, or make sure you ask dad about this from 10 to 11, it's going to be in one ear and out the other. Kids won't remember, they won't be paying attention. But if you have a whiteboard or something to write it on in their area where it's a visual, that's always going to be better than a verbal. We can use visual cues in other ways too. I like the idea of having a color-coded system for kids to know when we're busy. So I call this the red-green light system. The idea is, just like stoplights, red means stop, don't go, and green means, yep, bring it on, you can go now, you can come on in. So let's say we have to get something done. We have a deadline, we've got a report to do, we have a conference call. We can put a red piece of paper on our desk or on our door if we have a home office, or a red cup on our desk, a red Sharpie, doesn't really matter, just a visual for the color. And that's a sign that we cannot be bothered. We got something important to do. Or we can have green out. Green means, sure, come on in, I can help you. If you want to get fancy, you could even use yellow. It's kind of the in-between. Come on in if you need to, but it's not necessary. Really, the main colors are green and red. So the idea is that you practice this with your kids. So if you do it just on day one and say, we're doing this new thing today, guys, it probably won't work. But you have to practice it, and you give them different scenarios. And you'll say something like, okay, let's say that you and Emily got in an argument because she's being too loud. I have red on my door. What should you do? And let them play it out. Kids love that kind of pretend play. And it really helps them to understand how this will work. And there's a much better chance that it will go well. Also, we want to reduce power struggles with our kids when everything feels stressful. And if you leave with anything today, it's to focus on completion and not quality. You know, that means our job as a parent is to make sure our kids are online in time, that they're ready to go, and that they're generally focused, and that they're turning in their work. They're completing it. It's not our job as a parent to make sure that every last word is spelled correctly, every math problem is right, and that our kids have enough adjectives in their spelling sentences. That stuff doesn't matter. Let the teacher deal with the quality issue. She needs to know also if your child is having a hard time. So in general, again, focus on that completion part of it and leave the quality up to her. Now, as kids get older, especially in high school, we're not going to make them manage like that anyways because they're too old and they need to be independent. But there may be times when there are power struggles. We can use the blind eye strategy. And it goes like this. Listen, Jimmy, you know what? I noticed you're up late on Netflix a lot. I tell you what, I'm willing to turn a blind eye to you watching Netflix at night if you're willing to do these two things for me each day. And maybe those two things are getting up on time and being at the first class on time. So it's kind of a give and take. It's a little bit of a negotiation. You're willing to turn a blind eye to some behaviors if they're willing to do this. And then lastly, I'm a firm believer in family dinners. Family dinners are super helpful because even though we feel like we're with our kids all day long, they help to dial back some of the anxiety we're all feeling if the discussion is not at all about academics. So ideally in family dinners, we want to talk about anything but school. So we don't want to say, did you turn in this assignment? How's it going in science? Did you study for that test? All those things should be out the door, not important. Instead, take a look at thefamilydinnerproject.org. I really love this website. It has lots of conversation starters, even for those kids that are kind of reluctant and they don't always want to talk to us. We often see this as kids get older. But it's a great way to keep the lines of communication flowing with our kids, even if we're only having dinner together a couple of nights a week. So lastly, as we wrap up, connecting with teachers is vital in this period of time. You might remember at the beginning when I said it was different in March. Our teachers knew when our kids were having a hard time and when they weren't. They could just glance around the room. It's a lot harder now when we've got all these kids in a virtual atmosphere. So in talking to lots of my teacher friends and our tutors who are teachers, many of them are teachers, I've asked them, you know, what can kids do in this environment? And pretty much all of them said that they have to stay connected and they have to ask questions. They need to ask questions. And that was the #1 strategy most reported. So if we have a child who's really reserved, we want to really praise them if they raise their hand or send a private message to the teacher. If the teacher likes to be corresponded with over email, many of our kids, if we say, why don't you ask your teacher that? They'll have nothing to do with it. But if we help them to write the email and they get a positive response, so it might be something like, hi, Mrs. Smith, I'm really having a hard time reducing fractions. I'm wondering if I could ask you a few questions today at 3 o'clock. Does that work for you? And she writes back and it's something really positive for the student, they're more likely to ask again. So they just need to reach out those first few times at the beginning of the year and get a positive response back. So other ways we can reach out for help. As a parent, when do we know that our child needs a little bit more than what we can provide at home? And you know, often parents will call our office for help for their kids, and we see a couple of patterns. One is when kids are struggling with executive functions. So it's not that they can't do the work, but it's more that they're having a hard time keeping up with the flow of assignments. They tend to procrastinate a lot. It's hard for them to prioritize their work and then manage long-term projects. Those are all executive functions. If they're struggling with that and it's been a chronic problem, that's a time, it won't get better with virtual learning. It's probably going to be harder for them. That's a sign to you that maybe somebody else who specializes in that might be a good person to help them. Also, if you see that your child is struggling in a cumulative subject, and I mentioned this initially, like math, a math-based science when they're in high school, or a foreign language, those are all subjects where one skill builds upon another. No amount of trying harder or focusing more is going to get them out of that situation because they could have missed essential skills here. So they really need to keep in touch with their teacher. They're going to need to get individual help, either from their teacher or maybe somebody else that can explain it a different way, maybe a tutor. So in the end, you know, there's lots of things that we can do to help our kids, but if I had to prioritize 1, 2, 3, I would say first, make sure our kids are equipped for learning, that they have a really great designated workspace. And also know it might be fluid. What works for you the first week might be harder the second week. And this is trial and error for all of us. We might have to change it up. Keep the lines of communication open. Each morning, take a few minutes to chat with your child. Ask them about the schedule for the day. Also, take time once a week. This is a longer conversation when you're going to ask, tell me about your week ahead. What do you have going on? And that's when you're going to really talk about any extracurricular, something that might be different this week than in past weeks. And then lastly, and most importantly, we want to preserve our relationships with our kids. As much as possible, we want to keep things positive and we want to prioritize completion over quality. All right, so I would love to wrap up now and hear from you, questions that you have. So I'm going to go to the chat and, or actually, if you don't mind, can you put your questions in the Q&A? That would be super helpful to me. And also, if you missed it at the beginning, I wanted to mention that I've compiled an ebook that I just finished, and I think it's great, and I hope you love it too. It's called 6 Tips for Smoother At-Home Learning, Even When You're Dreading It. It's got 14 pages of lots of things that we can do to help our kids, and you can get that by texting 55444 and the words virtual. So let's see, Nicole, hi, thank you for being here with me tonight. Would you like to ask the questions, or actually I can see them here.
Yeah, there's some in the Q&A, and I also did put the poll up, and lots of people, 74% of our participants have actually responded on the poll. So if you want to pull that up, you can see
the
results of that.
Oh, thanks. Okay, great. The grade, nice. Thank you. I'm so glad you got that working. I couldn't get it working earlier, and I was so nervous about it. So I thought, oh, you know what? I just won't do it. But I'm glad that you're more technical than I am. So let's see. Parents say they're very confident. Most are somewhat confident about their workspace. Oh, that's interesting. And then is focus an issue? Most people said sometimes, 57%. And then if you're working from home, or your kid's able to work independently. And most people said sometimes. So interesting. Thank you, Nicole, for bringing that up and sharing that. That's super helpful. All right, so let's see. Let me go through some of the Q&A questions, and then Nicole, if somebody puts something in the chat and we have time for that, we'll double back with that. So I'm concerned about screen time. Do we need PE and specials? You know, I'm not sure. Every school district is different in that. And maybe somebody can put in the chat as to whether you're having PE or specials. My experience with other districts has been generally they are including that. And if they're not, for PE, I'd say absolutely yes. And the minute our kids are, you know, as I mentioned earlier, done with the class, I'd love to have them outside if that's possible, or doing something else that, again, is not in a screen. Because yes, we are all certainly concerned about screen time. How much supervision does a first grader need during online sessions, and how not to accidentally do their work for them? All right, so I do webinars every day, and I think this is really one of the biggest questions parents have is, how much do I help? And the answer is as little as possible. And I know that sounds strange coming from somebody who does this for a living, but actually there's lots of research on this. And we know that when parents help too much, meaning they sit by their child or they help them do the work, or they're micromanaging the quality and they're just overly involved all the time, it seems like those kids would do better, but actually it turns out those kids do worse. And part of the reason is kids start to believe, oh, if my parent isn't sitting next to me, I can't do this right. I must not be capable on my own. So ideally, we want kids, it's okay to let them struggle a teeny bit, not a ton, but our goal is to help them get started. Again, make sure they're logged on, they're connected, and they're going forward, and then walk away. And we don't really need to check on them unless these are designated times. So for example, they have a break or it's lunchtime, obviously. If we see them wandering around the house, that would be another cue that something's kind of up, and we'd want to check in on them then. But in the most part, if we see them online and then we see them like this, kind of daydreaming, that's not a cue to us that we need to go and correct them. Leave it alone. I'm okay with that. Let them figure out that they need to be more attentive. And it's also okay to bring that up to the teacher and use those magic words I've noticed. I've noticed Jimmy is sometimes having difficulty paying attention at home. Have you experienced this with other kids? Which you know she has. Teachers have had hundreds of kids over time. So ask, are there strategies that you have? Would you like me to handle this? Is this something that you can handle? What do you think is the best way to approach this? But in general, the more hands-off we can be, the better, except when our kids are really, really struggling, like they're not turning in their work. they're falling behind in one of those cumulative subjects, or they're chronically having executive function issues, then we obviously want to change our tune and help a little bit more. Let's see. If our kids weren't fidgety kids before, will giving them fidget tools get them hooked on these? So here's what I would recommend. If your kids aren't fidgety, I wouldn't give them fidget tools because they don't need them. They're able to focus on their own. So fidget tools will not make kids fidgety, but they just don't need them. So I would say I wouldn't even worry about it. It probably wouldn't be an issue for me. So I'd probably leave them because they're doing a great job already. What's a realistic focus time for kindergartners? 25 minutes seems like a long time. And the answer is yes. So generally kindergartners, I'd say for a lot of them, it's like 10 minutes. You know, they have very short windows. That 25 minutes is really for older kids. The other thing I might recommend for kindergartners, let's say it's, you know, downtime for them, is to set up stations in your house. So for example, you might have like a reading station where you have a bunch of books. You might say to her, go up in your room and get your favorite books and let's set this up like a little reading station. You might have an arts and crafts station. You might have a block station, you know, a puzzle station, whatever your kids like. And then if you're trying to work from home and you need to keep them busy, pull out the timer and set it for chunks of time. Kids can go longer than 10 minutes if it's something they like. So maybe set it for 20 minutes, 15 minutes and say, work in this station for 15 minutes. And when the timer goes off, you can either go to another station that you like, or you can stay in that station. And so the timer again makes them kind of chunk time, but they're also keeping busy with stations. It's kind of like the Montessori approach, Maria Montessori education approach, which is popular for young kids. I have a few quiet and small things like squishy balls for my first grader to keep his hands busy while the teacher talks, but he has focused solely on them and misses instruction from the teacher. Do I only give him one? Or do they take, I think she said, or do I take them away? The question popped up. So if your child is now obsessed with squishy balls, I would probably not give him squishy balls because it's not the right fidget tool for him. So instead, maybe see if he's able to focus in a different way. I've had kids, I think I showed you those sensory cushions for feet. Many of the kids we work with have these elastic bands that go at the bottom of the chair and they play with those for their feet. It could be that something tactile is maybe not right for your child at this time. So see if he does better with that and then go from there. Let's see, how will teachers know whether kids are getting it from their younger students, second grade? Some kids are afraid to ask the teacher using your raise your hand icon or questions in front of their peers. And you're right, teachers don't always know. And so that's why we need to be in touch with teachers a little bit more than usual. So it's a great idea to say, Mrs. Smith, I've noticed Sarah is really struggling with adding decimals, whatever it might be, and pointing it out to her. Now, most of the time our kids are in class, it's going to be synchronous, but sometimes it's asynchronous, meaning that they're not all together and there are small groups. So I found that with the school districts that have gone back to session already, this is what is so much better than in the spring. And I know that Arlington's had some technical glitches, but in general, what I've seen and what I expect to see is that it just keeps getting better and better because teachers learned what didn't work in the spring, and that was rooms that are too large. And so they're going into these smaller breakout rooms so that your child will get time, more personalized time with the teacher. Now, it might seem like, oh, I do think in the next few weeks the teacher will know. If you're concerned, email and use those words I've noticed. Let's see. What about snacks, foods, drinks at the workspace? I'm perfectly fine with that if that works great. Or you could kind of make that something to look forward to, and that could be something that they get when they're up, when they have that break. And that's kind of a nice thing to do during breaks too. So they don't always have to have it at their table. What's the right age for blind eye to be effective? When your child can reason with you. So blind eye would be not good for like a first grader, But you could definitely use Blind Eye for older elementary school kids. I think it's great. You can use Blind Eye for older kids too. My youngest son, he's a freshman in college now, but last year I used Blind Eye with him all the time because he had the worst case of senioritis. Plus he was in these virtual learning classrooms. And it was just real hard. And so I just knew I had to be a little bit more flexible and there had to be a little bit more give and take. Let's see, I have a 9-year-old and I'm having trouble with him not staying on MS Teams during class. If I'm not watching over his shoulder constantly, he's going to Wikipedia. How can I mitigate this? So there are really good websites that help kids blacklist, that enable kids or you to blacklist websites that are really distracting. One is called Stay Focused, which is a Chrome extension, and one is for Macs, which I'm not sure many of our kids have a Mac in this virtual environment, but that one is called Self Control, and they both do pretty much the same thing. And there's other ones too, but basically they allow you to blacklist websites that are distracting for their student. We use this a lot with middle and high schoolers and even older elementary kids because they can tell you, I go down a rabbit hole with these websites. And so it will allow students to say, I don't want to go to this, and that website. And no matter what they do, they can disable the app, try to restart their computer, they can't. So it might be that having more control is better. All right, let's see. How do I prevent kids from playing video games on the same laptop he uses for virtual classes? I've come across this before, and if it's at all possible, which I know it often isn't because not many people have 2 laptops for their kids, but if you can and your child can have a gaming laptop, I would make that completely off limits during the day. And ideally that's in your possession and your child can use that at night. So after they've finished their homework, and I wouldn't say something like, when you're done with your homework or when school gets out, you can play Xbox, because all they're going to be thinking about doing is the minute it's 3 o'clock, they'll say, I did my homework, and maybe they didn't. And they're going to be on Xbox from 3 to who knows what time. So it's better to say, you can have these things at 6 o'clock or whatever time you deem, a good time. But ideally after school, we want our kids out and getting some sunshine and exercise. So if you can have 2 different devices, that's great. But if not, I would look at parental controls, and I would look at the Google Family link, which I mentioned, and see if that can work for your situation. All right, let's see. Lots of questions. Nicole, do you have any on your chat that you wanted to mention? Because I have a bunch here.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people that had some questions regarding expectations for younger students, think for pre-K and their focus and, the duration and what is realistic for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so is this after school is over?
Probably during school, during the day.
Right. I mean, I will say that every kid's tolerance for online learning is different, at least what we've found. And some of the kids we work with can tolerate it for extended periods of time, some like 10 minutes. So I don't know if there is an end all be all, but I would say if you have a child with ADHD, that usually take their age +1, and that's about their limit for many kids before they need to take a break or move around or do something, switch gears. So I would say that for young kids, teachers, one thing I've noticed that they've gotten a lot better with is this year, again, for the districts that have gone back, what I'm hearing and talking to teachers is that they've really been cognizant of that, and they realize their kids cannot sit for that long. So they're making sure that they're up and there's tons of movement during the morning and they're not sitting in front of a screen, because that's not good for anybody. So I would say in general, take your age and add 1, and that's about it for most students. And then somebody mentioned, can you give more suggestions for non-screen break activities that could work for teenagers who only want to play video games or check TikTok? And what I will say is that you know, video games aren't horrible. Kids certainly can still play them, but what I would be more conscious of is the length of time in which they're playing them. Because what we know about brain development is that when kids are online for a long time, that's when these receiving neurons have this heightened expectation that they're always going to get this dopamine. And the more kids are online, the more the receiving neurons think that they need to have this all the time. But when students are online for about an hour and then they disengage and they do something else for an hour, for teenagers, it might be going outside or hanging out with a friend, and then they go back, it allows their brain to reset. But when they're always on for like 3 or 4 hours, that's when we see from lots of studies, that's the most dangerous. It's not really that they're on for an hour, off for an hour, on for an hour. That's not so bad as being on for that extended period of time. So that's what I would be more conscious of. And there's a fellow who is brilliant at this stuff, if you're interested, and his name is Clifford Sussman. He's a psychiatrist in Maryland, and his website, it's either Clifford Sussman MD or Cliff Sussman MD. Nicole, you might know, and we could probably put it in the chat, but I think he's fabulous. And he has a great website, and he has a page just for this type of thing. He's done a couple of webinars for us. I think he's great, and you can get lots of strategies through him as well. All right, so I know we have lots of questions, and we just have another minute or two left. But Kelly and Kathleen, as we wrap up, I had one more question for everybody, but is there anything else that you wanted to share with us before we wrap up for the evening?
Well, Anne, thank you so much. And thank you to so many folks who joined us tonight. We just wanted, as Kelly mentioned in the beginning, we're available to support you if you have specific questions, especially about unique learning challenges or needs. You can contact us at 703-228-7239 or email us at prc@apsva.us. We know the first few days have been a little bumpy, and I know that our administrators and technology specialists are working really hard. So we thank you all for your patience, and we look forward to welcoming Anne back again next week. But this was so great. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Kathleen. And we did add an additional session on Monday night due to the response from so many parents wanting to come this evening. So if you know somebody else that would benefit from this, Nicole, I know you put that in the chat, but we'll send that out as well to you. We'll send out a recording too. And then lastly, I just have a favor to ask you. I'm just wondering, what was your most helpful takeaway of this evening? What was one thing you learned that was maybe unique or unusual that you think can be helpful to you this school year? If you can throw that in the chat, that would be fabulous. And thank you so much. Instead of whys and lunch dates, everything, completion over quality, help as little as possible, going outside, fidget toys, blind eye, giving them space, clock, breaks and screen time, blind eye, 25 minutes or less. When mom said, I'm putting a big sign on a red sign on my door that says non-negotiable. That must mean she's busy. An hour on and off of screen time is better than 2 hours on for sure. Discuss the weekly and daily schedule, stay positive. Not all screens are created equal. Ask kids questions, don't overcorrect. The completion is a goal, Doodle Notes. Minimal intervention. Yes, these are all great things. So thank you everybody for throwing in what you took away, because that helps me to understand what was helpful to you and make sure that I do it again. So again, thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. It's been a real pleasure. If we can help your student with anything this school year, feel free to reach out to me. And if I did not get to your question, I'm super accessible over email. I will send you a personal response, I promise. And my email is Ann, A-N-N, @ectutoring.com. Thank you so much, everybody. It was great to see you this evening, and I wish you all the best this school year. Bye-bye.